All right, Chris, I can see you, so we are ready for you.
All right, I'm trying to figure out how to present a single screen on here. Is this software sophisticated enough to help me do that?
I can see, let's see here, I have to undock a bunch of stuff so I can get to you. You are going to have to go into your display settings.
Oh,
Do you see
uh,
that? There you
okay,
go.
let's try that. Is that the full screen presentation?
Yep,
Outstanding.
all good.
Okay, well, let's get started then. Hi everyone. My name is Chris Jackson. I'm a principal architect on the Windows Customer Experience Engineering team. Kind of a bit of a mouthful, but in essence, my role is to work directly with our enterprise customers around various Windows workloads, one of the important ones being Microsoft Edge. And to really think about what that means in terms of enterprise adoption. So I want to kind of spend some time talking about where we are, what we're currently shipping, as well as talk a little bit about where we're going and what you might expect. But kind of thinking through, what we're really trying to build here. We really want to make something that isn't particularly noticeable. Like if people don't want to pay a lot of attention to the browser that they have. They really just want things to work. And it turns out that browsers end up actually doing a lot of work. There's a lot of information out there. And we look at, hey, I've got information that's stored on my intranet, in cloud services, in SharePoint, both on-prem and online, in OneDrive, my LOB apps, on-prem servers, and in essence, people end up spending a huge amount of time just looking for information. People spend a lot of time in the web browser. It's one of the statistics that isn't in here. But interestingly, when you look at PC usage, more than half of people's time on their PC is spent inside of a web browser. Accessing and applications, whether they be software as a service or web apps that are stood up, or even just for fun. And we work across a number of different devices. We work at home. We work while we're on vacation, probably entirely too much. We work on our computers, on our mobile devices, on our tablets. We really want to get through and experience everything. And it's all connecting to this sort of centralized experience when we think about the things we're trying to build at Microsoft. And this actually is the single biggest change, I think, in terms of how we think of Edge and the web browser that we're trying to create. Because if you look back a few years in 2015, which is when we released the current version of Microsoft Edge, at that time, the mission was we're going to build the Windows 10 browser. Whereas today, what we're thinking is, no, we want to build the Microsoft browser, the browser that works best for Microsoft customers. We want to make sure that we're touching on, all of the investments that you have across M365 so that you're able to, tap into that enterprise grade security, to have a great experience on Windows 10, but to also have a great experience on your other devices as well. This work tends to happen in a browser, and that is exactly what we sought to build, is a browser with the enterprise in mind. So I'll kind of talk through some of the features, and I'll show off a few of them that are currently there. The next version of Microsoft Edge is what we believe a modern enterprise browser should be. And it kind of starts with App Compat. And for those of you who have known me in the past, that's what I spend a lot of my time thinking about, historically known as the App Compat guy. Because it turns out that really matters when it comes to productivity, when it comes to being able to leverage your investments. Is important that you're able to work with all of the content that's out there. And so we wanted to make sure that we're addressing sort of the emerging browser standards, which we capture by building it on top of the Chromium code base, which is where most modern applications are concentrating their testing, as well as getting full Internet Explorer 11 compatibility, which is where a lot of enterprise web apps live. In an ideal world, I guess maybe everything would be constantly brand new, but we don't live in that ideal world, right? In fact, the reality is that in the enterprise, the average age of enterprise software remains at about 12 years. The average age, which means that about half of it is even older than that. So we're dealing with, pretty durable investments that we want to make sure still work, that we don't have to do what I call getting on a treadmill, right? I don't want to have to update my application just to keep it working at all, because then I get hot, I get sweaty, I've expended a lot of work, and when I'm done, I'm in exactly the same place where I started. Instead, I want to be able to invest and drive things forward. So we kind of look across the different, pivots that we have. The first and really important one is we want to make sure we have rock solid fundamentals. We want to have, compatibility with the modern web. We want to make sure that we're able to update. And that was actually one of the big challenges we had with the current in-market version of Edge, is that being so deeply tied to Windows 10, you updated your browser by updating Windows 10. And that didn't always happen as regularly as perhaps some people predicted. That every 6 months was kind of often. And so if you stayed on older versions, particularly if you sort of took advantage of, hey, I have 30 months, you could have a 30-month-old browser. And with the speed of the web today, that could legitimately be a problem. So we wanted to have those updates become separate from the OS. We wanted to make sure that it works on all supported versions of Windows and on Mac, and that includes Windows 7, it includes Windows 8.1, it includes older versions of Windows 10, includes Mac OS. And one of the frequently asked questions that I get is, well, what about delivering Edge for iOS and Android? And some people have actually missed that. We released that a couple of years ago. So we have Edge as an experience as well already on iOS and Android. So to make sure that we can be everywhere that Microsoft's customers want us to be. A really important second pillar is to look at safety and security. How do we provide industry-leading protection from phishing and malware? And today in this cybersecurity landscape, phishing continues to be the primary entry point that we see over and over and over again. The email gets sent out, you get tricked into following it to a malicious website, and that becomes the beachhead by which the adversary starts to move forward. So we want to continue to, provide, the best defenses we possibly can against getting there in the first place. I mean, obviously, it's sort of tough to get to perfect levels of protection, to find all bad sites, but we want to prevent as many as possible before you ever get there. And then obviously for those that you do occasionally get there, to continue to have the security stack represent defense in depth to help protect you. We want to make sure that we're providing enterprise grade security features to protect your corporate data and to protect your network. The third pillar is manageability, and that's something that I know anyone who's dealing with, ConfigMan or Intune or anything else cares passionately about, is how do I control the experience and provide the right security experience, the right productivity experience for my users at scale, that it's not just that, hey, the users can configure themselves, that I can make sure that they get into the right configuration. So we give people, and IT pros in particular, the tools and flexibility they need to manage compatibility, security, and productivity. And the final one is to focus on end user productivity. How do we make the end user have a really good search experience to start to cut down on the time that they have to invest in, discovering information, as well as developers who are also important users, that we also have a best-in-class developer tool experience as well. So if we kind of then pivot to products and what does that really mean, from a fundamentals perspective, we made the very significant change to build on top of Chromium. And this is I know it's a huge change, caught some people by surprise. And it was something that we reflected on for a long time as we sort of made that decision. But in the end, we felt that this really would offer the best compatibility experience, but it also allows us to start to influence the overall ecosystem, because we are now checking in code directly into the Chromium code base that increases and improves the experience on Windows. And that means that every browser that is built on top of Chromium will benefit from that. And we make all of our Windows users better off. And then in Edge, we seek to differentiate by providing the better enterprise experience or user experience, whatever the case may be. But even if you are using another Chromium-based browser, you will still benefit from those investments. We have the separate update cadence. We are, as I said, contributing into open source across the board to make sure that we sort of improve the experience for everyone. In the security space, right, we have Smart Screen, which is something that's been around since IE9, and we'll kind of talk about how that works. Application Guard, Azure AD Conditional Access built right in without having to have any browser extensions enabled, as well as making sure that we build it the right way. For manageability, right, to have IE mode, which is a fantastic compatibility experience, particularly compared to the in-market version of Edge. We have over 180 policies, and we have enterprise-grade PDF support, which is one of the things that we've heard a lot of feedback on. Interestingly, right, I don't know that I would have predicted that a few years ago, but browsers several years ago started to introduce the ability to directly support PDFs. And we started to get a request of, hey, we could actually simplify our endpoint if that provided all of the PDF support we needed for most of our users, so we didn't have to install yet another product. And we've taken that feedback and tried to continue to enhance the PDF support that we provide in order to make it so that more devices don't have to install yet another piece of software, which has to be managed. And then for productivity, we have direct integration with Azure AD. That's actually really, really useful for both IT pros and developers. We'll talk a little bit about that and show that off. Sync across devices. We have the ability to control the enterprise experience for the new tab page. And we've also integrated Microsoft Search directly into Bing, and we'll kind of show what those things are. But let's kind of start from the beginning and safety and security and some of the defenses that we've been building. So when we think about, how do we, protect, and obviously the best way to protect against malicious software is to avoid it from getting on your device in the first place. So this is an area that we've been investing in for a number of years. As I said, we first introduced it in IE9, and there were sort of rudimentary things that happened before this. But the really big pivot that we saw with IE9 was the transition to protecting not just based upon things that are known to be bad, because unfortunately it turns out to be relatively difficult to enumerate all of the malicious websites in the world, right? It's trivially easy to spin up a brand new one once they've all been counted, and now your list is out of date. So the transition we made was to make our decisions based not only on, hey, these are known bad, but to also allow downloads in particular to build a reputation over time. Because not known to be bad is not the same thing as known to be good. And known to be good is sort of a tough, perhaps it's very aspirational, but known to be good does really rely upon, hey, do you have any kind of reputation? Do you have any prevalence? Particularly in today's world, we're seeing a lot of what we call polymorphic malware. So that's malicious software that changes over time. So it becomes hard to identify. But when you think about that against a reputation service, so a reputation service says, hey, you may not be known to be good. In fact, it's hard to sort of prove that something is definitely good. But if you've been downloaded a lot of times, if you have a lot of prevalence, then the chances that you are malicious and no one's found it goes down, right? Doesn't down to zero, but if I have 100,000, a million, 10 million, 100 million downloads with no reports of this being potentially malicious, then my trust in that software begins to go up. And so we do that, particularly for downloads, we have this reputation of, hey, it's not known to be bad, but it's not downloaded a lot. Like perhaps you should be a little bit wary of this, to provide that level of insight into what's happening, to build that into the Smart Screen service. We also look at how do we incorporate security across, the attacks to the browser, right? So it's not just let me sort of trick you into doing something, but once I've tricked you, how do I make it more and more difficult to have, getting you onto a website result in something being compromised? So we've been building on using the SDL Framework, which is the Security Development Lifecycle, for a number of years. In fact, really started that initiative a short while before Windows XP Service Pack 2. There was a memo that Bill Gates actually released that talked about, hey, we need to get to the reliability that the telephone service has, right? It was the trustworthy computing memo is what it was called. And this sort of really evolved from that, which is a whole new way of designing and building and testing software in order to, improve the overall security quality across the board, which has had very dramatic results, certainly within Microsoft as well as across the industry. We partner with a number of companies to provide this level of training. In fact, one of the founders of the movement, Michael Howard, who's written the book Writing Secure Code, which is, I think, volume 2 is still the most current one. He's written a book on SDL, is part of our consulting team working with a number of third parties on implementing SDL into their processes, doing reviews for, like, major events, things like that, to kind of make sure that, this approach and this philosophy gets adopted. We use a lot of static and dynamic analysis to go through and do some testing and simulate attacks against all the interfaces that we offer. We have penetration testing. We have a rewards program. So if, we actually have bug bounties lit up, against Microsoft Edge. In fact, we announced fairly recently the ones that we have against the upcoming version, as well as having, a rapid response system, so that if anything bad happens, we have the ability to respond very quickly. It's sort of a, inheriting that from the work we do on servicing it. We align to Chromium so that we, can benefit from any changes that happen across the ecosystem, and we have an update system integrated in there. Also, sort of on the differentiated side, is that we also in Microsoft Edge offer Application Guard. This is something that was available in the current in-market version of Edge that will also be available in the upcoming version based upon Chromium. So Application Guard, if you're not familiar, is the ability to contain inside of a container. In fact, I'll launch it and show off the experience. So let me drag a browser window over. So this is the current version of Edge, and I can actually just say, give me a new Application Guard window, and get that to launch, hopefully relatively soon. All right, and it's opening, of course, on the wrong window. So let me get that drug over. So yeah, it's the problem. It was in the wrong spot. So, with an Application Guard window, this is something that really the only way you can tell is you're going to have this Application Guard icon sitting on there. But if we take a look at it, and what I'll do is I'll drag over Process Explorer, and we can take a look at what's actually happening. Why are we not? Now we're going to lock up the Process Explorer. That's awesome. Give that a minute to calm down. Hopefully, there we go. I'm going to pick that window. And what we'll see is we're not actually looking at an Edge process at all. We're looking at, hey, this is just an RDP client that's showing me what's going on there. It's because this is actually sitting inside of what we internally at Microsoft refer to as a Krypton container. And what that means is it's an actual Hyper-V container. And if I go back to the slides, I can show a little bit of the architecture. So let me click that back up real quick. What we're doing is we're actually inside of Application Guard. We have a micro container, right? So it's a Hyper-V container, but what we don't do is we don't have to copy the entire OS and do an additional complete OS install, which has ramifications both for disk space utilization as well as for resource consumption in real time. So rather than loading up the entire thing, what we can do is project into that instance of the container the binaries from the host OS itself. So for the Edge content binaries, for the Windows binaries that you need, all of that is simply projecting from the already installed version. So the only thing we have to allocate in terms of space inside of the container are all of the areas that are going to be writable from that container. So we can significantly minimize the resource consumption that we require in order to support that, while providing Hyper-V as a boundary between the two of those. And it's a really good boundary. That's some, for those of you who kind of think on the security space, there are a limited number of things that in Windows we refer to as a security boundary. And the virtual machine boundary is one of them. And in fact, it's a really, really important one because it is that VM boundary that allows us to support things such as multi-tenancy in products such as Microsoft Azure, which leverages virtual machine in a multi-tenant way. Obviously, very important for us to be able to support that as a security boundary in Windows, and we are taking advantage of that exact same thing here. And what that means is, here I am in an application guard window. If anything were to compromise this, so let's say I were to come across a malicious website that was going to, compromise the web browser. Maybe they knew of some zero-day vulnerability that, no one knew about yet, and they leveraged it, or maybe they leveraged a vulnerability and I was a little bit behind in servicing. So therefore, I hadn't patched it to update and mitigate against that vulnerability yet. If that were to happen, they would capture this virtual machine, but not the host OS, because I have that VM boundary between the two of them. Now, this micro VM is actually going to be recycled the next time I log off. So, even if something were to happen, it would be happening inside of the container. The container is going to get recycled and refreshed the next time I log off and log back on. And then anything that had happened inside that virtual machine is going to be discarded. So it gives me really differentiated protection. Now, from an enterprise perspective, it ends up being very important to configure that the right way, because I've had some people not be aware that, hey, I don't get a fresh VM for every single website. I have a single shared VM. And I want to treat this as this is where I'm going to put things that are hostile. So defining the perimeter of my network, so both my internal sites for anything that I have that's on-prem web servers, as well as the bits of the cloud that I consider to be an extension of my network. So Office 365, if I'm using some of the security features, so maybe, Windows Defender ATP, if I'm, using ServiceNow maybe to manage my help desk. There may be a bunch of support things that I want to put inside of the trust boundary. Those I would want to run native. So the definition that I put in for AppGuard is going to be all about defining what gets there. So rather than sort of relying on how I launched it, which is just, hey, launch a new app window, but to instead say, you know what, I'm going to define what lives in AppGuard, what lives outside of it, so that when I'm browsing to potentially untrusted places, I have that level of protection. So that's a really good feature, particularly for very security conscious customers. The one bit of guidance I would have is that this feature really does work best with 8 gigs or more of RAM, and that's documented on all of the docs.microsoft.com pages, so it's not really a surprise. But it's a reminder that turns out to be, a pretty good judge point. If you want to experiment with, some particular devices that may not have that, then, my recommendation is pilot that first and make sure that it ends up being a good experience for users. But that's, in general, what we tend to find. And then the next thing is that we also, have integrated features for complete security. So things like Azure AD Conditional Access. You can use that today on Chrome, but you have to have an extension put in place so that, this is something that's actually built in directly, so I can leverage conditional access to gate access to cloud resources based upon a number of different factors. So whether it can be device compliance. I know one of the things we've added with Windows Defender ATP is to mark a risk score for the device. So if we have a detection that says, hey, this device appears to be at higher risk, we've detected some potentially malicious software on it, until you manage that alert or until the automated alert response completes, it's going to be marked at a higher level of risk. I can actually put a conditional access rule based upon the device risk. And that conditional access rule can be applied directly into what we're doing in Microsoft Edge. Similarly with Windows Information Protection, to have a first-class experience that is able to help gate how information can be leveraged across different applications on the device. So security, obviously something super important to us. And we think we've built, a lot of really valuable features on top of the baseline of Chromium. So we also want to make sure that we focus on end user productivity. And this is one of my personal favorites, which is the ability to have native Azure AD sign-in and multiple profiles. And this one I'll kind of, show off a little bit. Let me get this AppGuard window back out of the way, and I'll showcase how I use this. So I have, my Azure AD account, which is, my addmicrosoft.com. But I also have multiple additional accounts that link to other tenants. So I have one that allows me to have access to a demo environment for desktop analytics. So I have a separate profile for that. I have one that I use, which is sort of has a friendly name of the Beavis. It's one that I use for, a test lab that I use for the very fortunate friends and family who have me managing their devices. So we've got Intune and Defender ATP running there, as well as something that we're doing in the Windows engineering org, where we have these multiple different identities. It makes it very easy for me to switch between them and just launch a new window as that person fully logged in. So I'm fully logged in with an Azure AD account. So I have a great single sign-on experience with those multiple accounts. And I noticed that a lot of people really enjoy this when they have multiple accounts. And a couple of scenarios that I've seen have been, hey, I have a separate account that I use for administration of some servers and services from the one that I use for my day-to-day productivity. Now, from a recommendation standpoint, if I'm administering high value servers or services, the recommendation would be I should probably use a privileged access workstation to do that. But for lower value work or for test environments, perhaps, I don't need that deep level of security. And instead, I just want to start with having the separation of identities as a first step, that I can do it for that. So maybe some administration tasks, maybe in a different environment or a lower risk environment. Or if I have dev, test, and staging profiles, if I'm a developer, the ability to switch easily between those, but have it be a fully integrated single sign-on experience is actually really useful for implementing that kind of functionality. So that's one that's great. We do have sync across devices, and that sync is currently already enabled for personal accounts. So if I have a Microsoft account, sync should already be working. We are gradually rolling out sync for Azure AD accounts. And from a Rings perspective, and if you're dealing with Windows as a service, Rings is a bit of a buzzword. But it's actually a really useful buzzword. It's what we use ourselves to deploy software within Microsoft, and that same approach, something that we do internally, and we do the exact same thing for the features as we roll them out. We used to kind of call it dog fooding was the term that we use, kind of referring to we eat our own dog food to make sure it's something that's good. And so we have Rings that we deploy. And kind of the way that the initial few Rings go is step one, the first ring is the engineering team working on Edge. So if they wrote some software that's going to be, potentially impactful, they have to live with it first, so that they live with it day to day and sort of see it, feel it, touch it, and experience it before it goes any further. Then it goes more broadly within Microsoft, so across engineering, and then eventually sort of across the field, and we then make it available externally. But it's really, let's put a pretty good test group out there before we get to our actual customers. Trying to balance between, hey, let's get it to customers' hands pretty quickly, but let's make sure that we're reasonably sure that what we have for you to test with and experiment is of, reasonable quality. That the things that you're finding are going to be novel things that are unique to those environments. So right now we're kind of in that ring process for deploying the Azure AD Sync. So I'm not actually sure where we are in that process. So maybe some of you have it already, but it ends up being really important. For having that cross-device experience. I mean, I personally think it's really, really powerful for me on a couple of different spots, right? So number one is I use multiple devices. When I'm at home, I've got a desktop tower computer, just like I've always had, that supporting 3 monitors, so I can get big graphics cards and things like that in there. Then when I travel, I grab my Surface Book, and that syncing, make sure that the two are always up to date. I modify them and modifies them across all of them. The second place I find it really useful is I run multiple channels. We kind of talked about the rings that we run. And let me take a quick snip and then drag it over, but I'll show you what I'm currently running today. I'll just take a screenshot of my taskbar real quick. There we go. Let's drag that over and we'll kind of zoom in on that. But this is how my taskbar is laid out today, which is we have multiple rings that can also be run by customers. So we've got what we call the stable version of Edge. And this is the current in-market version of Edge. So it's the one that's based upon Edge HTML. But we also have Beta, Dev, and Canary. And to kind of explain kind of how the channels work, Canary is in essence a daily build. So every day there's a brand new one. If you want to see what's coming next, Canary is the place to do that. It's also the place where if something goes awry, you're going to see it the next day. Then if something gets fixed, you'll see it fixed the next day. So that you are sort of always on top of what's happening in the browser world. So for browser enthusiasts, this is a sort of a neat place to go. It's actually my default browser. Dev is what kind of most people start with if they're not interested in being quite as much of a riskophile, if you will. I don't know if that's a word or not, but if not, I just made it one. That's a weekly build, right? And that's going to have a lot more sort of stabilization going on that we release about once per week. And then there's the beta build, which is once every 6 weeks, followed by the stable build. And in essence, hey, when a new stable build comes out, you will also have a new beta build at around the same time, which is going to preview the very next build. And those are going to line up with, the Chrome builds are going to have a very similar timing between the two of them. But what that allows you to do is to have internal rings. So I can say maybe my development team will want to run some of their devices on the dev ring. Maybe I want to have a subset of my users running on the beta ring so I can sort of have a bit of an early warning system on anything that might be potentially impactful coming in the stable ring to provide some early feedback. And it is, a lot easier to take feedback in any, beta or earlier to take feedback and incorporate it, because as soon as something reaches stable, then changing is by the definition different. And once something has hit stable, people do tend to start to build on top of that. And so a change may end up being a breaking change. And so sort of the earlier in the process you get, the faster it is to get results, and sort of the less regression testing that goes into that, because, fewer people have taken hard dependencies on that. So, that's one of the things I recommend having a think about is, hey, what's the right mix for me to deploy in my organization and to my users to sort of figure out, how do I, get some early feedback and, participate to the level that I'm interested in participating in the browser world. And what I do is I run all of them, right? That allows me to go and see the experience, and sync will also sync between the different channels. So if I have, all 4 of them, I can, in essence, maintain my state a single time and have that transition across all of my different channels all at the same time. So whether it be across devices or across channels, sync is actually really good for keeping users productive. We also are integrating Microsoft Search through Bing, and that's going to have a great experience. In fact, let's go take a peek at that. So let me get back into my context, and I'm just going to do a search for Chris Jackson, search for myself. And what that'll do is through the integration with Bing, it'll actually pull up from Office 365. Hey, here's some information about me, right? Here's my email, my alias, my IM. Here's the things that I've been working on. And it'll pull up all that information. Or let's say I wanted to look up Bill Gates. I could see information about that, right? I can, here's the, news center. So I can see internally, hey, what do we have? It's internal news. I can look at, different sites, files, teams, and conversations, all from the Microsoft 365 graph, all still integrated. So really focusing on making, enterprise context, appear wherever it is that I'm working, to try and help people find the content they need without having to go to multiple different sites. I mean, that to me is the big frustration is, hey, I want information on this. Is it published publicly? Is it published internally? Now I don't have to go to the internal SharePoint search and the external web search to find the same thing. Similarly, when we sort of look at the information that's in Graph, we also have an enterprise new tab page. And if you sort of look at the new tab page, there's actually a few different options. So I'll just sort of click on new tab page, and I have mine set up to be, hey, connect me to Office 365, or I could switch it over and say, hey, I want to get news, and it'll kind of give me the Microsoft news, and I can have multiple different layouts, whether it be, just give me a search bar, give me a search bar and a nice picture, or give me a whole bunch of information below, sort of the distractors. The kind of the way I think of it is, and I kind of go back and forth between, hey, do I want to have like a nice picture and that's it? That one's a little boring for me. But the Office 365 is the, hey, I thought I was going to go to Twitter, but it turns out you're reminding me I have a lot of work to do. So that's a way for me to, kind of kick that back up and put me directly into the context of what might you be doing inside of that experience by connecting to the Microsoft Graph. And the other pivot, obviously super important to anyone from the manageability side, is that we want to make sure that we have a really good manageability across the board. And it really starts with compatibility. And this is, to me, the a really, really important aspect is this should work for all of your websites. I have no problem with people using multiple browsers. If it's something that you are a browser enthusiast and you like to have multiple ones installed, there's nothing wrong with that. What I don't like is when we force users to remember which browser to use for which website when they don't want to get involved in that. And what they really want is just to open a browser and have it work. And IE mode is really designed to be that experience, and it's really seamless. So if you've used the Internet Explorer compatibility solution for the current in-market version of Edge, it really is pop open a whole new browser, which enterprises find very inconvenient. It's interesting because I've been working in the browser space for a lot of years, and I do remember like every single time we had a transition, when we introduced IE8, they said, can we do 6 and 8 side by side? When we introduced 9, they're like, can we do 8 and 9 side by side? When we introduced 10, like, why can't I have both was always the question. And I think we've answered that now, because technically, if you think of Edge as being like an IE 12, if you will, you have 11 and 12 side by side. And it turns out no one actually wants that. What they really want is, let me open a browser and just have all of my stuff work in it. And that's the experience that we sought to build. So we'll look at, I'm actually going to open up the beta build. And so, yeah, one tip that I have is that, in order to leverage IE mode, you have to be running in one of the channels that's installed at system level. So, beta and dev, both of them, if you're doing a manual double-click install, will prompt with a UAC elevation. And if you say no, or you can't because you have no admin rights and you're automatically declined it, it will actually go ahead and install it at user level. And at user level, IE mode today doesn't work. And Canary, by default, installs with user level from the beginning. So there's actually a switch to, it's a kind of -- system -level in order to do it that way. If it's not involved, it's installed for the system, then we don't engage IE mode. We're actually exploring whether we can get past that constraint. But for today, it is a constraint. This is why I'm running, in this case, the beta build. And once I have it installed, then I need to enable it. So if I go to Edge flags, I can do a search for Internet Explorer. I've already enabled it. I can put it in IE mode. I can also, of course, do this by group policy. So that's something that is something that most people would enable, is I'm going to do it by policy. But if I'm just experimenting with it, I can set it via a flag as well. So once I have it enabled, then I need to configure, well, which sites do I want to leverage? And I just made a list using the Enterprise Mode Site List Manager V2. We will be building a V3 because there is one scenario that's not covered by the V2 schema, and that scenario is that I'm unable to say I actually need to open a full IE. There remain a couple of scenarios where I need the entirety of Internet Explorer. Those scenarios are, I have a toolbar, because toolbars are currently not supported. If you have a scenario where you need them, please let us know. We're actually, send a frown. You've got this little icon down here. Send that feedback and let us know where you need to use a toolbar for IE support, because we don't know of any enterprise scenarios where we need one. That's why we haven't built it. But if you have one, we are eager to hear that feedback to see whether we need to build it. And the other scenario I know is if you're actually changing the UI, like you're changing menu items, because you obviously don't see the full Internet Explorer UI, you don't see the menu items, so they don't show up here. So you may need to open it. We have an option to do that. But if you do have to do that, please send a frown and let us know the scenario so that we can understand, hey, is that something that we could do so that you no longer have to? So once I've filled that, I actually have set the enterprise mode site list to point to the XML file. This is just a local file. And if I look at the registry entries, one of the things that is different is that Edge now just looks directly in the IE policies. And the current in-market version of Edge, we used to have one for IE and one for Edge. Now there's only one, because again, we don't know any of scenario where you'd need two. I know a couple of customers who built two different site lists, but to me, it's get you into IE and use the right setting. We should be able to do that with a single list, and so that should hopefully simplify it a bit. I did this directly via the registry. Another little tip or trick, I don't know if this is going to last, but as of right now, if I'm in HKey local machine and I add a site list debug, notably, we've validated this doesn't work in HKey current user. It's only for local machine. The site list entry itself can be either user or machine, but there you can add a new key that's for right now works, which is site list debug, which allows you to do side by side, because within Microsoft, we actually have an ME list already. So if I want to test something of my own, I need to be able to see that. So I can see that I've built in the archive. I'm just going to navigate to a vintage Microsoft website from around 2000. It'll give me some great news all about Windows 2000. And without changing context, without changing the browser, it directly opens. And the only clue that I have is I have a little blue IE indicating that, which if I'm troubleshooting, hey, why isn't this rendering or laying out correctly, that gives the help desk an easy place to go and look to see, oh, well, IE mode is triggered, so that's not the problem. So particularly early on as you're testing that out, you can validate it that way. So I can see I'm getting close to time here. I've got 1 minute left, so I'm gonna, apparently I've been rambling on for too long, but you can kind of see the experience. We browsed through that. We also have a number of different policies. I'll quickly show the group policies. There are ADMX files. We are currently working on building a first-class experience into both SCCM and Edge for manageability. We now have support, so if you have run all the latest Windows updates, we now have support for Intune management, so that required a little bit of work on the Windows side to support that, but that is now live, so you're able to do it with Intune and import the ADMX there. We have the ability to both set policy, set preferences, those are overridable, as well as configure how you update. And that's an important one, which is updating is something that you get to control. So whether you want to do a manual push through SCCM and Intune, or whether you want to have it update itself, it will use Microsoft Azure to do the updates and sort of reach out through that mechanism to automatically self-service, leveraging a service on the device. So it really depends upon whether you want to, have what's called a sort of a, green button deployment, push to go, or whether you want to have it be a red button, push to stop, that you can make the choice that's right for your organization. And perhaps it's a mix, right? So whether you want to have us manage it or you manage it manually, you get the choice to do that. We talked about PDF support, so we have really good integration. So that's, give that a try as well. We're curious for impact, and we really want to make sure that what we're building is something that really meets your needs, provides you with the ROI, it hits the scenarios that really matter to you. So what I'd love to see people doing is, go give it a go. We have now released a beta build, and that is our flag. We think this is ready for organizations to start testing it. The beta is the most stable build we offer. We have policies available. We've got documentation available. We're eager for feedback on both the product itself, the documentation, the scenarios. Feel free to reach out to me. You can find me on Twitter. I'm at AppCompatGuy. Or you can appcompatguy@microsoft.com is my email. Feel free to reach out to me, send a smile, and provide that feedback, because we are really, really eager to make sure that we're delivering the right browser to make enterprises more productive. And with that, I'm 2 minutes over, but thank you very much for the time.